The smell of burnt sugar and shattered dreams still haunts me when I close my eyes. It was the morning that changed everything. The morning when Valerie Quinn thought she could destroy my life with one calculated accident and a performance worthy of a soap opera. What she did not know was that she was about to hand me the greatest gift any entrepreneur could ask for. The perfect origin story for a multi-million-dollar empire built on spite, sugar, and the sweetest revenge imaginable. I had never intended to become the villain in someone else's story. I had simply wanted to bake beautiful things and maybe win a ribbon or two along the way. But sometimes the universe has other plans, and sometimes those plans involve watching your dreams literally hit the floor while your saboteur fake gasps her way to victory. My name is Fiona Wexley, and this is the story of how one woman's jealous meltdown became my signature flavor and turned the most humiliating moment of my life into a dessert empire that spans from Portland to Boston. But let me start at the beginning, when I was still naive enough to believe that competitive baking was about skill rather than sabotage. I had been running a tiny bakery in Southeast Portland for 3 years, the kind of place that barely registered on anyone's radar except for my mother, my golden retriever Murphy, and Mrs. Chen from next door, who always confused me with her granddaughter, but bought cupcakes anyway. My little shop, Sweet Surrender, was tucked between a vintage record store and a coffee roastery, surviving on word-of-mouth recommendations and the occasional food blogger who stumbled in by accident. I was not making millions. I was barely making rent. But I was happy in that particular way that comes from doing exactly what you are meant to be doing, even when the world seems determined to ignore your efforts. The Pacific Northwest Bake Off had been calling my name for years, but I had never felt ready. The competition was legendary in our region, drawing professional bakers and culinary school graduates from across the country. The winner received a cash prize, national recognition, and most importantly, the kind of credibility that could transform a struggling neighborhood bakery into a destination. I had finally worked up the courage to enter during the spring registration period, submitting my application with shaking hands and a prayer to whatever deity watched over small business owners and dreamers who bit off more than they could chew. My specialty had always been tarts. There was something about the precise architecture of pastry, the way flavors could be layered and balanced, the satisfaction of achieving that perfect texture, where the crust yielded to the filling without falling apart. I had spent weeks perfecting my contest entry, a layered blackcurrant and lemon tart with a brown butter crust that I called Sunset Tension. The name had come to me during one of those magical Portland evenings when the sky turns every shade of pink and gold, and the air smells like possibility. The blackcurrant provided the deep, complex darkness of evening, while the lemon brought the bright acidity of the last rays of sunlight. The brown butter crust tied it all together with its nutty richness, creating something that was both familiar and completely unexpected. I had tested the recipe dozens of times, adjusting the ratios until they sang in perfect harmony. The judges at the preliminary round had called it surprisingly perfect, and I had floated home on a cloud of validation and hope. That was when I first encountered Valerie Quinn. If Central Casting had been looking for the archetypal competitive baker villain, they could not have done better than Valerie. She was in her early 40s with platinum blonde hair that never moved, even in the humid kitchen environment. Her aprons were always perfectly pressed, adorned with strategic pearl pins that caught the light just so. Her eyebrows were surgically precise, arched in a way that suggested perpetual skepticism about everyone else's worthiness. But it was her laugh that truly set her apart. High-pitched and sharp, it had the quality of breaking glass, the kind of sound that could curdle cream and wilt lettuce from 30 feet away. She deployed it strategically, always at moments when maximum psychological damage could be achieved. Valerie had been the reigning queen of the Pacific Northwest Bake Off for 3 consecutive years. Her specialty was elaborate show-stopping cakes that looked like architectural marvels, but, according to whispered rumors from other competitors, often prioritized appearance over actual flavor. She had turned competitive baking into performance art, complete with a devoted following of amateur bakers who hung on her every word and a social media presence that treated each competition like a personal coronation. The problem with queens, I would learn, is that they do not like to share their throne. I first met her during the mandatory competitor orientation, held in the sterile conference room of a downtown Portland hotel. She had swept in 15 minutes late, her entourage of admirers trailing behind her like the tail of a particularly dramatic comet. The room had gone quiet as she surveyed her competition with the calculating gaze of a predator, sizing up potential threats. Her eyes had lingered on me longer than the others, taking in my simple black apron, my nervous fidgeting, my obvious status as an outsider to this world of professional competition. "Oh," she had said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "You must be the little neighborhood baker everyone is talking about." The word little had been delivered with surgical precision, designed to diminish not just my business, but my entire existence. The other competitors had shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension but unwilling to get involved in whatever drama was about to unfold. "I am Fiona," I had replied, extending my hand with a smile that I hoped appeared more confident than I felt. "I run Sweet Surrender in Southeast Portland." She had looked at my offered hand as if I were presenting her with a dead fish, then smiled that razor-sharp smile that would become so familiar to me in the weeks that followed. "How quaint," she had said, turning away without shaking my hand. "I am sure it will be a learning experience for you." The dismissal had stung, but I had told myself that her attitude was just nerves, the natural competitiveness that came with high-stakes competition. I had no idea that I was looking at someone who viewed my very presence as a personal insult, a challenge to the natural order that she had spent years carefully constructing. The weeks leading up to the final competition had been a whirlwind of preparation and practice. I had closed Sweet Surrender for 3 days to focus entirely on perfecting my technique, running through the recipe over and over until I could execute it blindfolded. My tiny apartment kitchen had been transformed into a laboratory of sugar and flour, every surface covered with test versions and notes scribbled on index cards. Murphy had grown fat on discarded attempts and imperfect crusts, his tail wagging enthusiastically every time I pulled another tray from the oven. My mother had taken to calling me twice a day to make sure I was eating actual meals, and not just surviving on sugar and caffeine. "You are going to do wonderfully, sweetheart," she would say, her voice warm with the kind of unconditional support that only mothers can provide. That Valerie woman does not know what she is up against. I had told my mother about the orientation encounter, and she had immediately decided that Valerie Quinn was public enemy number 1. It was sweet if misguided. I still believed that the competition would be decided on merit, that the best baker would win regardless of politics or personality conflicts. I could not have been more wrong. The final competition was held at the Portland Convention Center, in a purpose-built kitchen that looked like something from a cooking show. Gleaming stainless steel surfaces, professional-grade ovens, and enough lighting to illuminate a small city. Each competitor had been assigned a station with identical equipment and ingredients, everything carefully measured and inspected to ensure fairness. I had arrived early, wanting to familiarize myself with the space and settle my nerves before the chaos began. The morning light streaming through the convention center windows had painted everything in soft gold, and for a moment, I had felt genuinely optimistic about my chances. That optimism had lasted exactly until I reached my assigned station. Something was wrong immediately. The surface of my work area was sticky, as if someone had spilled syrup and made only a half-hearted attempt to clean it up. My measuring cups were slightly out of place, arranged in a way that suggested they had been handled. Most alarming of all, several of my carefully pre-measured ingredients had been switched around. The container labeled lemon zest smelled suspiciously like lime. The blackcurrant puree had the consistency of grape jelly. Someone had been at my station, and they had not been trying to help. I had looked around frantically, trying to catch the eye of one of the competition officials, but they were all busy with last-minute preparations. The other competitors were focused on their own stations, either unaware of my situation or deliberately ignoring it. All except Valerie, who was watching me from across the kitchen with an expression of innocent curiosity that did not quite hide the satisfaction in her eyes. "Is everything all right, dear?" she had called out sweetly, her voice carrying just enough false concern to make my skin crawl. "You look a bit flustered." I had wanted to march over to her station and confront her directly, but I knew it would accomplish nothing except making me look paranoid and unstable. Instead, I had focused on damage control, quickly identifying the tampered ingredients, and trying to salvage what I could from the situation. The competition organizers had provided backup ingredients, but they were not the same quality as what I had brought. The lemon zest was less aromatic, the blackcurrant puree slightly too sweet. Small differences that might not matter to a casual observer, but could be the difference between victory and failure in a competition this precise. I had managed to reconstruct my recipe with the substitute ingredients, working with the focused intensity of someone defusing a bomb. Around me, the other competitors had fallen into their own rhythms, the kitchen filling with the familiar sounds of whisks against bowls and ovens coming to temperature. Everything had been going reasonably well until I had reached for my third tart shell, the backup I always prepared in case of disasters. It was not there. I had searched my station frantically, checking every shelf and cabinet, but there was no mistake. Someone had taken my backup tart shell, the insurance policy that every experienced baker knew to prepare. Without it, I would have no margin for error, no safety net if something went wrong with my primary entries. The panic had started as a flutter in my chest and quickly escalated to full-blown terror. I had looked around the kitchen again, hoping to spot my missing shell at another station, perhaps moved there by accident. Instead, I had seen Valerie watching me again. That same expression of feigned innocence now tinged with something that looked suspiciously like amusement. When our eyes met, she had shrugged delicately, as if to say that these things happened in competition. I had no choice but to continue with what I had, working with extra care to ensure that my remaining tart shells would be perfect. The filling came together beautifully despite the ingredient substitutions, the blackcurrant and lemon finding their balance, the brown butter crust achieving that perfect golden color that indicated proper baking. I had been putting the finishing touches on my presentation when it happened. Valerie had been walking past my station, carrying what appeared to be a bowl of something sticky and pink. Later, I would realize it was probably the raspberry coulis for her own dessert, but in that moment, all I knew was that she was moving through the kitchen with the kind of theatrical grace that suggested she was very aware of being watched. She had been just behind me when she suddenly gasped, a sound so sharp and dramatic that several other competitors had looked up from their work. "Oh no," she had cried, her voice pitched perfectly to carry across the entire kitchen. And then my beautiful tart, the one I had spent weeks perfecting and hours that morning reconstructing from sabotaged ingredients, was sliding off my work surface and onto the floor in a cascade of broken pastry and shattered dreams. The silence that followed had been deafening. 20 competitors and a dozen officials had all turned to stare at the wreckage at my feet. The remains of my sunset tension, tart spread across the convention center floor like a crime scene. "Oh no," Valerie had continued, her hand pressed dramatically to her chest, her eyes wide with what I now recognized as completely manufactured shock. "Clumsy me. I am so sorry." She had even managed to produce what looked like genuine tears, her voice breaking with apparent remorse as she surveyed the destruction she had so carefully orchestrated. "It was such a beautiful tart," she had continued, addressing the crowd of onlookers as much as me. "I feel just terrible about this accident." The word accident had been delivered with just enough emphasis to make it clear that she was covering her bases, establishing the official narrative before anyone could suggest otherwise. Several witnesses had nodded sympathetically, murmuring about how these things happened in the stress of competition. I had stood there in shock, staring at the ruins of months of preparation scattered across cold concrete. The judges had approached cautiously, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and professional disappointment. "I am afraid this means disqualification," the head judge had said gently. "Competition rules require a completed entry for final judging." "But I have one more tart," I had protested desperately, gesturing toward my remaining entry. "It is still perfect, still ready for judging." The judge had shaken his head. "The rules specify that each competitor must present 3 identical items for evaluation. With only one tart remaining, you no longer meet the minimum requirements." And just like that, it was over. Months of preparation, weeks of practice, thousands of dollars in ingredients and entry fees, all reduced to nothing by one woman's jealousy and perfectly timed accident. I had been escorted from the kitchen area to watch the remainder of the competition from the sidelines, a spectator to my own elimination. Valerie had gone on to win first place with a towering cake that looked impressive, but, according to several competitors I spoke with later, tasted like cardboard decorated with buttercream. The drive home had been a blur of tears and rage. I had pulled over twice to cry in gas station parking lots, overwhelmed by the injustice of what had happened and my own powerlessness to fight back. By the time I reached my apartment, I was exhausted from fury, drained of everything except a bone-deep certainty that I had been robbed. Murphy had greeted me at the door with his usual enthusiasm, tail wagging as if I had returned victorious rather than defeated. I had collapsed onto my couch still wearing my competition apron, too emotionally spent to even change clothes. That was when I noticed the small container sitting on my kitchen counter. In my haste to leave for the competition, I had forgotten to pack my final backup tart, the one I had made the night before as an absolute last resort. It sat there perfect and untouched, a reminder of what could have been. I had eaten that tart in my pajamas while rage-watching cooking shows, and plotting elaborate revenge fantasies that involved public humiliation, and possibly arson. The blackcurrant and lemon had tasted even better than I remembered, the brown butter crust crispy and rich. Everything balanced in the way that had made the preliminary judges call it surprisingly perfect. It had been somewhere between my third slice and my fifth cooking show that the idea had first whispered itself into existence. If Valerie could turn a meltdown into a moment, I could turn it into a brand. The thought had been so unexpected, so audacious, that I had actually laughed out loud for the first time since the morning's disaster. Murphy had lifted his head from his bed, confused by the sudden sound of amusement in what had been a thoroughly miserable evening. But the more I thought about it, the more perfect it seemed. Valerie had given me something more valuable than any competition prize. She had given me a story, an origin myth, a reason for people to root for the underdog who turned sabotage into success. I had spent the rest of that night pacing my small apartment, ideas tumbling over each other in an avalanche of possibility. A dessert cafe named after my saboteur, a signature flavor inspired by the very tart she had destroyed, a whole brand built around the idea that sometimes the best revenge was not getting mad, but getting even in the most deliciously public way possible. By dawn I had filled 3 notebooks with ideas, sketches, and business plans. I had designed logos, planned menus, and even started researching commercial real estate. The humiliation of the competition had been transformed into fuel for something bigger than I had ever dared to imagine. 6 months later, I signed the lease on a beautiful corner space in downtown Portland, just blocks from the convention center where my dreams had been shattered and reborn. The space had previously been a failed fusion restaurant, but I could see past the outdated decor to the potential underneath. High ceilings, large windows, and enough square footage for both seating and a display case that would make people stop in their tracks. The renovation had taken 3 months and every penny of my savings, plus a loan that had required me to put up sweet surrender as collateral. It was the biggest risk I had ever taken, but it had also felt like the most inevitable decision of my life. I had named the new cafe the Valerie, a choice that had scandalized some of my friends and family, but felt absolutely perfect to me. The logo was a cartoon drawing of a cupcake having a dramatic meltdown, complete with tears that looked suspiciously like frosting, and an expression of theatrical despair. But the real masterstroke had been the signature flavor, bitter berry. It was my original sunset tension tart, reimagined as a more accessible dessert that could be served by the slice or transformed into cupcakes, cookies, or even ice cream. The blackcurrant provided the bitter, while the lemon added brightness and complexity. But I had added one crucial new element, a spicy raspberry swirl that provided an unexpected kick, a reminder that revenge should never be served cold when it could be served with a little heat instead. The cafe had opened on a rainy Tuesday morning in October, with a line of curious customers stretching around the block. Word had spread through social media about the bakery with the provocative name, and the owner with a score to settle. Food bloggers had shown up with cameras, local news stations had sent reporters, and the story of the sabotaged baker who turned her humiliation into a business had captured imaginations across the city. The first customer to order bitterberry had been a food critic from Portland Monthly magazine. She had taken one bite, raised her eyebrows in surprise, and immediately ordered 3 more slices to go. Her review, published 2 weeks later, had called bitterberry a masterclass in turning pain into pleasure. with flavors complex enough to suggest that revenge is indeed a dish best served sweet. The cafe had gone viral within a month. Food influencers had flocked to Portland specifically to try the dessert inspired by baking competition drama. TikTok videos featuring the origin story had racked up millions of views. The hashtag Bitterberry Revenge had trended nationally. And yes, Valerie had come too. I had spotted her one Thursday afternoon, lurking near the window wearing oversized sunglasses and a baseball cap pulled low over her distinctive platinum hair. She had clearly thought her disguise was effective, but I would have recognized that perfectly arched posture anywhere. She had ordered a single slice of bitterberry and a coffee, paying in cash and avoiding eye contact with my staff. I had watched from the kitchen as she found a corner table and took her first tentative bite of the dessert that had been inspired by her sabotage. The expression on her face had been worth every sleepless night and financial risk of the previous year. Surprise, followed by grudging appreciation, followed by what looked suspiciously like envy. She had finished the entire slice before leaving without a word. 2 days later, a 1-star Yelp review had appeared under the username QueenBeeCrumble, describing the Valerie as pretentious and claiming that the bitterberry tart was trying too hard to be clever. I had printed out the review, framed it, and hung it in the customer bathroom with a small placard that read, "Our first fan fiction." The business had grown faster than I had ever imagined possible. Within 6 months, we were turning away customers on weekends. Within a year, I was fielding calls from investors interested in franchising opportunities. The second location had opened in Seattle 18 months later, followed by San Diego, then Austin, then Boston. Each new cafe maintained the original concept while adding local touches and seasonal specialties. But more importantly, each location featured a rotating menu of limited edition desserts inspired by moments of petty drama and competitive spite. Sabotage Swirl had been inspired by my tampered ingredients, a chocolate tart with deliberately mismatched flavors that somehow worked perfectly together. Petty Pistachio Crunch was a nod to a food blogger who had criticized my amateur presentation style, featuring pistachios arranged in delicate, precisely geometric patterns. Oops. All Meltdowns was a deconstructed cake that looked like a beautiful disaster, inspired by every fake accident and calculated mishap I had witnessed in the competitive baking world. But nothing had ever outsold Bitterberry. It had become my signature, the dessert that launched 1,000 receipts and turned a moment of professional devastation into the foundation of a multi-million-dollar empire. The success had attracted attention from beyond the food world. I had been profiled in business magazines as an example of turning adversity into opportunity. I had given talks at entrepreneurship conferences about the power of authentic storytelling in brand building. I had even been approached by a television producer interested in developing a reality show about competitive baking drama. But the moment that had brought everything full circle had come the previous spring, when I received an unexpected phone call. "Ms. Wexley." The voice on the other end had been crisp and professional. "This is Janet Morrison from the Pacific Northwest Bake-Off Organizing Committee. We would be honored if you would consider serving as a celebrity judge for this year's competition." The irony had been so perfect, so beautifully cosmic, that I had actually laughed out loud. "I would be delighted," I had replied. The competition had been held in the same convention center, in the same purpose-built kitchen where my dreams had been demolished and reconstructed. But this time, I had been sitting at the judges' table instead of frantically working at a competitor station. The current crop of contestants had been a mix of familiar faces and fresh talent, all displaying the same nervous energy and competitive intensity that I remembered so well. The kitchen had buzzed with the same sounds of whisks and timers, the same atmosphere of controlled chaos and barely contained ambition. And there at Station 12 had been Valerie Quinn. She had looked older, her platinum hair showing signs of darker roots, her signature apron slightly less crisp than I remembered. But the arched eyebrows were still surgically precise, and that laugh still had the power to make nearby milk curdle. When she had spotted me at the judges' table, her face had gone through a series of emotions so rapid and transparent that I had wished I had brought a camera. Shock, recognition, fear, and finally a desperate attempt to regain her composure. She had dropped her meringue. The bowl had slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers. shattering against the floor in a spray of white foam and ceramic fragments. The sound had echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot, causing every other competitor to look up from their work. Oops, I had called out cheerfully from the judges' table. Accidents happen. The emphasis on accidents had been deliberate and unmistakable. Several of the other judges had looked at me curiously, but I had simply smiled and made a note on my judging sheet. Valerie had managed to recover enough to continue with her competition entry, but the damage had been done. Her signature confidence had been shattered along with her meringue, and it had shown in every aspect of her performance. When the judging round had arrived, I had approached her station with the same professional demeanor I had used for all the other competitors. Her entry had been a classic tart, beautifully presented but fundamentally uninspired. I had taken a careful bite, analyzing the flavors and textures with the expertise I had developed over years of recipe development and customer feedback. The crust had been soggy, the filling flat and one-dimensional. It had tasted like something designed by committee, safe and predictable and utterly forgettable. Interesting choice, I had said, making notes on my evaluation form. Though I feel like it is missing something. A certain complexity, perhaps a bit more bitterness to balance the sweetness? The other judges had nodded thoughtfully, unaware of the layers of meaning in my seemingly innocent critique. When it came time to assign scores, I had given her entry a 4 out of 100. In the comments section, I had written, "Lacks the depth and sophistication one expects from an experienced competitor." For a better example of how these flavors can work together, I recommend trying the bitter berry tart available in aisle 3 of the Valerie Cafe chain. The plug had been shameless and probably unprofessional, but no one had challenged it. By that point, everyone in the food world knew the story behind the Valerie, and most people seemed to appreciate the poetic justice of the situation. Valerie had not placed in the competition. She had not even made it to the final round. I had watched her pack up her equipment with the same mechanical movements I remembered from my own elimination. The stunned disbelief of someone whose world had just shifted on its axis. As she had walked past the judge's table on her way out, I had called her name softly. "Valerie." She had stopped, turned, and for a moment we had looked at each other across the years and all the success and failure that had passed between us. "Thank you," I had said simply. She had stared at me for a long moment, perhaps trying to detect sarcasm or cruelty in my words. But I had meant it sincerely. Without her sabotage, without her perfectly timed accident and theatrical gasps, I never would have found the anger and determination that had fueled my transformation from struggling bakery owner to successful entrepreneur. She had not responded, just turned and walked away with whatever dignity she could salvage from the situation. That had been 6 months ago. Since then, the Valerie had opened 3 more locations and launched a line of frozen desserts available in grocery stores nationwide. Bitterberry had become the best-selling flavor, outselling traditional options like chocolate and vanilla by significant margins. I had also published a memoir called Accidentally on Purpose: How Sabotage Saved My Business, which had become a bestseller in the business and memoir categories. The book had spawned a successful podcast, speaking engagements, and even a development deal for a streaming series about competitive baking drama. But perhaps the sweetest success had been the most recent development. A partnership with a national baking supply company to create a line of professional-grade equipment and ingredients designed specifically for small business owners and aspiring entrepreneurs. The tagline for the campaign was "Turn Your Accidents into Assets," and the launch video featured me recreating the original Sunset Tension tart that had started it all, complete with a recreation of the accidental destruction and the moment of inspiration that had followed. The video had gone viral within hours, inspiring thousands of comments from people sharing their own stories of turning setbacks into comebacks. It had been viewed over 50 million times, and had led to speaking requests from Fortune 500 companies wanting to understand how to build authentic brands around authentic stories. Standing in the flagship Portland location of the Valerie on a busy Saturday afternoon, watching customers line up to try desserts inspired by competitive baking drama, I often thought about the path that had led me here. I had not set out to build an empire on spite and sugar. I had simply wanted to bake beautiful things and maybe win a ribbon or two. But sometimes the universe has other plans, And sometimes those plans involve learning that the best revenge is not getting mad, but getting even in the most deliciously public way possible. The afternoon light streaming through the cafe windows painted everything in soft gold. The same warm glow that had filled the convention center on that fateful morning 3 years ago. Customers chatted over slices of bitter berry and sabotage swirl, their laughter mixing with the sounds of espresso machines and the gentle hum of satisfied conversation. Behind the counter, my staff worked with the same focused intensity one had once brought to competitive baking, plating desserts with artistic precision, and taking pride in creating something beautiful and delicious. They wore aprons emblazoned with the Valerie logo, that cartoon cupcake having a dramatic meltdown, and they served each customer with genuine enthusiasm for the story behind their orders. A young woman approached the counter, scanning the menu with the kind of careful attention that suggested a first-time visitor. "I keep hearing about this bitter berry tart," she said to my manager Zara. "What makes it so special?" Zara smiled, launching into the practiced but heartfelt explanation she gave dozens of times each day. "It is inspired by our founder's experience at a baking competition," she began. "Someone sabotaged her entry and got her disqualified, but instead of giving up, she turned that negative experience into the inspiration for our signature flavor. You can really taste the complexity. There is sweetness, but also depth and just a little bit of spice. It is like turning bitter experiences into something beautiful." The customer's eyes had lit up with recognition and delight. "That is such an amazing story. I will definitely try a slice." As Zara cut a generous portion of the tart that had launched 1,000 receipts, I felt the same satisfaction I experienced every time someone discovered our story for the first time. Not the petty satisfaction of revenge, but the deeper pleasure of transformation, of taking something painful and making it purposeful. The customer took her first bite, and I watched her face go through the same progression of surprise and appreciation that I had seen thousands of times before. The initial sweetness giving way to complexity, the recognition that this was something special, something crafted with both skill and story. "Wow," she said, her eyes widening. "This really is incredible. You can taste. I do not know how to describe it. It is like there is a whole narrative in every bite." That was exactly what I had been hoping to achieve. Not just a dessert, but an experience. Not just a flavor, but a feeling. The knowledge that sometimes our worst moments can become the foundation for our greatest successes, if we are brave enough to transform pain into purpose. As the afternoon wore on, and the cafe filled with the usual Saturday crowd, I found myself thinking about Valerie Quinn, and wondering what she was doing with her life now. Part of me hoped she had found her own path to transformation, her own way of turning setbacks into comebacks. But mostly I felt grateful. Grateful for her perfectly timed accident and theatrical gasps. Grateful for the humiliation that had forced me to think bigger than I ever would have otherwise. Grateful for the reminder that sometimes the universe conspires to give us exactly what we need, even when it comes disguised as everything we think we do not want. The Valerie had become more than just a successful business. It had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that our failures could become our foundations, our saboteurs could become our inspiration, and our worst days could become the first chapters of our greatest success stories. Every time someone ordered bitterberry, I smiled and thought about that morning in the convention center. The sound of breaking pastry and shattering dreams. The moment when I realized that sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is having someone try to destroy your plans. Because when you build something new from the wreckage of someone else's sabotage, you create something that cannot be destroyed. You create something that grows stronger every time someone tries to tear it down. And you create something delicious enough that even your saboteurs cannot resist coming back for another taste. The last customer of the day was a familiar regular, an elderly gentleman who always ordered the same thing: one slice of bitterberry and a cup of coffee black. "The usual, Mr. Patterson?" Zara asked with a warm smile. "You know it," he replied. "That tart never gets old. There is just something about it that makes me feel like anything is possible." As he settled into his favorite corner table with his dessert, I realized that was exactly the feeling I had been trying to create. Not just satisfaction, but possibility. The knowledge that setbacks could become setups, that accidents could become advantages, and that sometimes the best revenge was simply living well and serving it with a smile. I locked up the cafe that evening with a deep sense of contentment, the kind that comes from building something meaningful from the ground up. The Valerie had started as an act of defiance, but it had become something much more important. A celebration of resilience, creativity, and the sweet taste of turning your pain into someone else's pleasure. Tomorrow would bring new customers, new stories, and new opportunities to share the message that failure was not the end of the story, but often just the beginning of a better one. And somewhere in the city, perhaps Valerie Quinn was going to sleep knowing that her moment of sabotage had created something beautiful, something lasting, something that would outlive whatever petty satisfaction she had gained from knocking my tart to the floor. That was the sweetest revenge of all. Knowing that her worst impulses had become the foundation for my greatest success, and that every single day, hundreds of people across the country were tasting the flavor she had inadvertently inspired. The irony was delicious, literally and figuratively. As I drove home that night through the familiar streets of Portland, past the record store and coffee roastery that had been my neighbors during those early struggling days, I could not help but marvel at the journey that had brought me here. From a tiny bakery that barely registered on anyone's radar to a multi-million-dollar dessert empire. All because one woman had thought she could destroy my dreams with a perfectly timed accident. The following week brought news that would add another perfect chapter to the ongoing saga of the Valerie versus Valerie Quinn. I received a call from Marcus Rivera, a food industry journalist who had been following my story since the early days of the cafe's viral success. "Fiona, you are not going to believe this," he said, barely containing his excitement. "I just got word that Valerie Quinn is opening her own dessert shop." I nearly choked on my morning coffee. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious. She is calling it Perfectly Sweet, and advertising it as a place for refined palates who appreciate classical desserts without gimmicks. The grand opening is next month, right here in Portland, just 6 blocks from your flagship location." The audacity was breathtaking. After years of watching my success from the sidelines, Valerie had apparently decided that if you cannot beat them, copy them. But what she had failed to understand was that the Valerie was not successful because it was a dessert shop. It was successful because it had a story, an authentic narrative that resonated with people who had ever been underestimated or sabotaged. "She is really going to try to compete directly with me?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "It gets better," Marcus continued. "According to my sources, she is planning to serve something called True Berry Tart as her signature item. Apparently, it is her original vision for how blackcurrant and lemon should be properly balanced." I laughed so hard that I had to sit down. The woman who had sabotaged my original sunset tension tart was now trying to claim that she had been the true innovator all along. It was such a transparent attempt at revisionist history that it bordered on the absurd. "Are you going to do anything about it?" Marcus asked. "Absolutely," I replied. "I am going to send her a fruit basket for the grand opening." The fruit basket I sent was a work of art, filled with the finest blackcurrants and lemons I could source, arranged with professional precision and accompanied by a note that read, "Congratulations on your new venture. I hope you find the inspiration as sweet as I did, Fiona." The note was signed with the logo of the Valerie, that cartoon cupcake having its dramatic meltdown. Valerie's grand opening was, by all accounts, a disaster. The local food bloggers who attended reported overpriced desserts with uninspired flavors, served by staff who seemed confused about the concept they were supposed to be promoting. The True Berry Tart was described by one reviewer as aggressively mediocre, like someone trying to recreate a memory of something they had never actually tasted. The shop lasted exactly 4 months before closing permanently. The space was eventually taken over by a yoga studio, which seemed somehow fitting. But the real vindication came in the form of a letter I received 2 weeks after Perfectly Sweet's closure. It was handwritten on expensive stationery, the kind that suggested someone was trying very hard to maintain appearances even in defeat. "Dear Fiona," it began, and I could practically hear the reluctance in every carefully formed letter. "I suppose you have heard about my recent business venture and its outcome. I am writing to acknowledge something that I should have said years ago. You won. Not just the business competition, but the larger question of who we each chose to become after that day at the bake-off. I have spent the last 3 years watching your success and telling myself that it was built on gimmicks and publicity stunts rather than genuine talent. I convinced myself that people were drawn to the Valerie because of the story rather than the food, and that somehow made it less legitimate than what I was offering. But I was wrong. I tasted your bitterberry tart when I visited your cafe in disguise, and I have to admit that it was extraordinary. Better than anything I had ever created, and certainly better than my pathetic attempt to recreate it. You took the concept I tried to destroy and made it into something beautiful, something that brought people joy rather than just satisfying their hunger. More than that, you turned a moment of cruelty into a force for inspiration. You could have let what I did to you make you bitter and small, the way it would have affected me. Instead, you used it as fuel to build something larger than either of us could have imagined. I do not expect forgiveness, and I am not asking for it. I just wanted you to know that I understand now what I was really competing against all those years. It was not your baking skills, though they were always superior to mine. It was your character, your ability to transform pain into purpose and setbacks into comebacks. I hope you continue to find success in all your endeavors. The world is a sweeter place because of what you have built. Sincerely, Valerie Quinn. I read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning and genuine remorse. It was not the dramatic public apology that part of me had always imagined, but it was something more valuable. A private acknowledgement of truth, offered without expectation of reciprocation. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the frame next to her original 1-star Yelp review. They belong together, a before and after snapshot of how people could change when forced to confront the consequences of their actions. That evening, I drafted a response on Valerie letterhead, keeping it brief and professional. Dear Valerie, thank you for your letter and your honesty. It takes courage to acknowledge when we have been wrong, especially in situations where pride has been invested for so long. I want you to know that I never took what happened personally, even in the immediate aftermath. Competition brings out both the best and worst in people, and we both learned valuable lessons about who we wanted to be under pressure. I hope you find a path forward that brings you the same satisfaction and sense of purpose that I have discovered in my work. There is room in this world for all kinds of sweetness. Best wishes for your future endeavors, Fiona. I never heard from her again, but I occasionally wondered if she had found her own version of transformation, her own way of turning setbacks into strengths. The Valerie continued to grow and evolve, adding new locations and new flavors inspired by the ongoing adventures of entrepreneurship and competition. We launched a line of baking classes called Accidents Welcome, teaching home bakers that mistakes were often the beginning of innovation rather than the end of possibility. The memoir spawned a sequel focused specifically on business strategy and brand building, which became required reading in several MBA programs. I was invited to speak at conferences around the world about authentic storytelling, resilient leadership, and the art of turning your worst day into your origin story. But perhaps the most meaningful development was the scholarship program we established at culinary schools across the country. The Valerie Foundation provided funding for students who had faced significant setbacks or challenges in their culinary education, helping them transform their obstacles into opportunities. Each scholarship recipient received not just financial support, but mentorship from successful food industry professionals who had their own stories of overcoming adversity. The program had already helped launch dozens of successful careers, creating a network of chefs and bakers who understood that failure was not the opposite of success, but often its most important ingredient. 5 years after that first cafe opened its doors, the Valerie had become more than a business. It had become a movement, a reminder that our worst moments could become the raw materials for our greatest achievements. Standing in the latest location, a beautiful space in downtown Boston that captured all the warmth and whimsy of the original Portland cafe, I watched a young baker carefully plate a slice of bitter berry for a customer who had traveled specifically to try the famous tart. Is it true that this flavor was really inspired by someone sabotaging the owner? The customer asked, echoing a question I had heard thousands of times over the years. It is true, the baker replied with a smile. But the real magic was not in the sabotage itself, but in how she chose to respond to it. She could have gotten bitter, but instead she got creative. As the customer took her first bite and her face lit up with delight, I felt the same deep satisfaction that had sustained me through every challenge and triumph of the past 5 years. Not the shallow pleasure of revenge, but the profound joy of purpose, of building something that mattered, something that would outlast any individual success or failure. The Valerie had started as my response to one woman's cruelty, but it had become something much more important. A testament to resilience, creativity, and the sweet possibility of transformation. Every customer who walked through our doors, every employee who took pride in their work, every entrepreneur who heard our story and found the courage to turn their own setbacks into comebacks, they were all part of something larger than any individual achievement. That night, as I locked up the Boston location and prepared to fly back to Portland for the next board meeting, I realized that Valerie Quinn had given me the greatest gift any competitor could offer. She had shown me exactly who I did not want to become, and in doing so, had helped me discover exactly who I was meant to be. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well. But even better than that is living purposefully, creating something beautiful from the wreckage of someone else's worst impulses, and serving it with a smile that says thank you for the inspiration. Every time someone orders bitterberry, I think about that moment in the convention center when my dreams hit the floor, and my real journey began. I think about the choice between bitterness and creativity, between revenge and resilience, between getting mad and getting even in the most deliciously constructive way possible. And I smile, because I know that the sweetest victory is not defeating your saboteur, but transforming their worst moment into your greatest strength, one perfectly balanced bite at a time. If this story inspired you to turn your own setbacks into comebacks, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories of resilience, revenge, and the sweet taste of success. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, so you never miss another tale of triumph over adversity. Remember, your worst day might just be the first ingredient in your greatest recipe for success. Thank you for watching, and may all your accidents be happy ones.